Meeting is being recorded. My name is Nick Martin. I'm the public member for Congressional District 4, and I am also vice chair, and I'm filling in today for Commissioner Daubenberger for the first part of the meeting, just the first hour or so, and then I think she'll be joining us. So I'll chair the first hour or so. Executive Director Nuschler, I think what's next is for you to call the roll.
Yes. And starting with Commissioner Grace Arnold, I think couldn't join us, but we were expecting Assistant Commissioner Louise Miltich. Or anyone else from Commerce? Nope. Board Member Bakken. Board Member Bauer-Kemper.
Present.
Board Member Cunningham, I believe, is not joining us, but I believe we have Assistant Commissioner Dan Huff.
Hello.
Chair Daubenberger is, I believe, not with us yet. Board Member Foster.
Here, yes.
Board Member Hintz. Board Member Katzenberger.
Here.
Commissioner Kessler.
Here.
Board Member Connor Steenberg.
So I'm here.
Chair Martin.
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon.
Present.
Board Member Nelson.
Present.
Commissioner Peterson.
Here.
Commissioner Roberts Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Stroman.
Here.
Chair Van Amberg.
Present.
And I believe from Met Council, we're expecting Sue Vento or Charlie Zelli. It looks like we have, I think 11 voting members with us. 1, 2, 3. Yes, so we do have a quorum.
Great. Okay, thank you. The first item on our agenda is the approval of the consent agenda. The minutes from the April meeting are in your packet at page 5, and the agenda for today's meeting in the packet at page 3. So we'd like to adopt the April minutes and today's agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
I would make that motion.
Commissioner Kessler.
Second.
Commissioner Peterson. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Okay, no opposition. The motion carries and the consent agenda is adopted. Just one thing to mention before turning over to Executive Director Nuschler. Hazel will be sending out an email with a poll asking whether there are dates that board members cannot meet in June, July, and August. She'd like responses by May 26th so that she can schedule those meetings. So that'll be going out, I guess, shortly. Excellent. And so I'll turn it over to Director Nuschler for the Executive Director's report.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Just a couple of informational items for you all. One of the things you all may have noticed yesterday afternoon, we received, yesterday morning we received, and yesterday afternoon, Hazel sent out some public comments given to the board about a project that's going on in Duluth. And I just want to give you all a little information so you can understand those comments better. And this is my summary of the situation from our discussions primarily with the petitioners. There was a petition for an EAW, a citizen petition on a hotel project, because that's called the Kinstuff Hotel in Duluth. The petition was sent to us. The EQB designated the city of Duluth as the RGU for determining the petition. There was an initial decision that the petition would be granted and an EAW was ordered. That was published in the EQB Monitor on April 25th. Subsequently, through the processes that the city of Duluth has, there was a change in that decision, and the city council ordered a negative declaration of the petition, and so did not grant the environmental assessment worksheet petition. And that decision was published in the EQB Monitor yesterday. And so if you read the comments, there's a lot of concerns and questions about the process and the procedure, and that's what many of the comments are pertaining to. So that's just very quick summary, so you have some context for those. I don't know if anyone will be joining us to make those comments verbally later, but we can certainly, assuming that they do, we can talk about it more at that time. A couple of other items. We are still in the early phases of drafting the work plan for the staff for next year or the next biennium. And the continuous improvement work that we've been hearing about is certainly going to result in some of our decisions about what we work on. One thing we really do want to work on is to have a tribal coordination policy for the EQB itself. We don't want to mess with anyone's agency tribal coordination and consultation policies, but we need one for the EQB. And so Kayla and I have been working on that and developing a plan for how to move that forward. If anyone is interested in helping us to draft and review that policy and do some of the tribal coordination and reach out on that, please reach out to me and let me know if you would be interested in helping. That would likely involve reviewing staff drafts and potentially participating in meetings with tribal staff. So just reach out. We would love to have a couple of extra people looking at it as we craft that over the next probably 6 months or so. A brief update on the Odyssey project, the launch of our online services, that is happening like right now. So the way in which the EQB Monitor is being produced is changing as of today, essentially. And we have our new online submittal service where the RGUs do need to make accounts and log in and to submit their materials, but it should make the monitor much more easy for us to produce, and also will propagate a database that will allow some mapping and better display of projects, both current and historical. So we're very excited about that, and probably you will hear more about that next month or in a future meeting, but that is happening. And I think it's been about 3 or 4 years or more since this project got started, so it's very excited to have it going live. And kudos to the Minute team and Jesse and Hazel who are working on that, and all the folks, many folks in the past who worked on that. One of the other things that we're exploring is participating in the Increasing Diversity in Environmental Careers program. This is a program that MPCA, DNR, and Bowser have been doing for a few years, where there are cohorts of college students who come in that are often first-generation college students or from underrepresented communities that are very interested in going into environmental careers, and they intended to reduce and eliminate barriers that inhibit underrepresented students from completing STEM degrees and getting into the environmental field. And so we're trying to get connected to that. And in June, before our next meeting, the staff are going to be participating in the training. The participating agencies do some training and sharing of their work and what they do with the student cohorts. So I'm very excited about that, the chance to get to work with that. And then in the future, we might have the opportunity to have some student workers helping us out. So this is a really good opportunity. I think that's really it for my updates. I had kind of legislative updates still ongoing. I know we'll be losing people today as they're going back and forth to legislative hearings, so we'll have all that ironed out by Tuesday. But I think the items EQB was most concerned about are all moving forward as expected. So that's my report. I'm just going to do a little bit of agenda and logistics at this point. As we noted, this meeting is recorded. For the board members, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of the presenters during each of our agenda items, and we do want feedback on both of these items to let us know if we're on the right track, what things we should consider moving forward. This is our first hybrid meeting in a while, and we're in a new space. So if you have any feedback on how this is working for you, how this goes afterwards, you can let Hazel know or let me know. If you can't hear or can't see something or something goes wrong in the moment and you're virtual, you can, through WebEx, send a message to the host and Hazel will see that. So hopefully this goes well. Let's try to make it feel as much as possible like we're in the same room. So if you're virtual, please raise your hand or jump in. As we finish presenters, we'll move off the slideshow mode and it will be easier for us to see all of you on the virtual world. Also, it'd be helpful if you state your name each time you speak. For any members of the public that are joining us, we do welcome public comment. There will be opportunity for that during agenda item 6. If you want to make some public comment, bring up a topic for future discussion. If you would like to comment, there are procedures and guidelines on page 2 of the meeting packet. I don't believe we have any members of the public with us here at this time. So if anyone virtually would like to comment when we get to that part of the agenda, use the hand raise feature in WebEx and or use the chat feature to request to make public comment. I think we would prefer the raised hand, and then we will call on you at the appropriate time, again, when we get to agenda item 6. If you have any technical difficulties or procedural questions, you can email the info.eqb email address. You can ask the staff in the back if you're here. You can chat the host of the meeting in WebEx, and we will do our best to help you. And I think that is it from me at this point.
Great. Thank you, Director Nuxola. Any questions from board members on the Executive Director's report? Could raise your hand or just jump right in. Okay, hearing none. Next on the agenda, we have the Genetically Engineered Organism update. EQB State Pollinator Coordinator, Dr. Rebecca Gutierrez Moreno. I'm sorry, that's probably fairly bad.
Excellent.
Is here to present. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Chair Martin. And good afternoon, members of the board and of the public that may be joining us. Again, my name is Rebecca Gutierrez Moreno, and I am the State Pollinator Coordinator with the Environmental Quality Board. But today I will be talking about a different subject, which is the EQB's regulatory framework for the release of genetically engineered organisms. See if this works. Yes, this works. Okay, so first I want to show you kind of like an outline of this presentation so you know what we'll be talking about. I want to give you a background on genetically engineered organisms and EQB's regulatory framework, like the background of how that happened, how that was developed, and what it is now. Then I will be talking about what is coming as well that we need to be preparing for. And finally, some next steps that EQB staff think we should be doing. So there we go. Okay, so for this meeting, we would like the board to understand their authority. After this meeting, after this presentation, we would like the board to understand their authorities related to GEOs on their, oh, who is doing that?
No.
Okay. Okay, there's a goat somewhere. Under Minnesota statutes 116C and Minnesota Rules Chapter 4420 and 4410-8000 related to permitting and the environmental review of genetically engineered organisms. And I'm going to say now, from now on, GEOs. That's a very long name. Then we would like the board to provide direction to us on one, if or when developing a specific permitting program for GEOs is or will likely be necessary, and 2, additional questions and information that should be provided prior to developing any program on GEOs. And finally, that the board, that you will all have background sufficient to make any future decisions on establishing such a program. It's a very ambitious goal. So just a little bit of background on this. Genetically engineering has multiple applications. It has advanced new developments in industry, agriculture, medicine. And in Minnesota to date, we have only had agriculturally related GEOs being released in the environment. However, we know that non-agriculturally related GEOs are in the making, and they will be coming in the future that will need to be regulated. And EQB has the authority to permit and conduct environmental review for these projects as the responsible governmental unit. So at the federal level, GEO regulation is administered by various agencies. We have the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, Food and Drug Administration Agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And in Minnesota, legislative and regulatory development related to GEOs occurred during the late 80s and early 90s. The objective of this regulatory efforts, developing these regulatory efforts, was to set up a non-duplicative process, acknowledging that there may be several, both state and federal agencies that with authorities to permit these organisms and also to conduct environmental review. But we also need to remember that state level permitting and environmental review are often more stringent than federal requirements. So when another agency, state agency, requires a significant environmental permit for the release of GEOs, the EQB can essentially defer to that agency's authority and requirements and not issue a release permit. So this is the case for agriculturally related GEOs, where in Minnesota since 1991, the board acknowledged that MDA had significant environmental permit to regulate this organism. So ag-related GEOs are plants, fertilizer, pesticides, plant and soil amendments that result. As a result of this, the Minnesota legislature gave MDA the authority since 1991 to regulate the permitting and environmental review of ag-related GEOs. And MDA's authorities fall under Minnesota Statute 18F and Minnesota Rule Chapter 1558. So as a result of all those efforts conducted in the late 80s, early 90s, the following recommendations were produced, developed, and we can see that EQB is designated the coordinating agency for Minnesota regulatory activities related to GEOs, and EAW is required for any proposed release. An advisory committee was established to provide advice on proposals, and Minnesota need to be proactive in developing and obtaining knowledge for meaningful regulation. And as a result of these recommendations, amendments were done to Minnesota statute section 116C91 to 116C95. And these statutes require an EAW for all releases of GEOs, a permit for the release of GEOs into the environment, and directs the EQB to adopt rules to give effect to these requirements. So I'm going to explain a little bit of what those rules are, which rules are these rules, and what they require. So Minnesota Rule Chapter 4410-8000 is the one that is the special rules for releasing GEOs for the environmental review regulatory framework for EQB. So in this rule, the environmental review for the release of GEOs with exceptions when EQB is the RGU, and it provides specific decisions criteria. So for example, we have that some of those specific decisions criteria specific for GEOs are, for example, the biological properties of the introduced DNA, the vector if one exists, the recipient, and the history of any previous environmental uses of the GEO, the potential for the GEO to cause adverse environmental effects. Then we also have the GEO permitting framework, and this is related to Minnesota Rules Chapter 4420. In this one, we know that unless another agency has permitting authority, EQB is the default permitting authority. And this is with the objective of being non-duplicative. So in this rule, we have specifications about the applicability of the rule. So when a release permit is required for releases of GEOs, provides exceptions, application procedures and requirements that specifies when the application needs to be submitted, acceptance procedures, related notices and distribution. Then we have release procedures and requirements and the basis of decision. So it gives the board how to determine the standards and considerations for issuing, denying, or revoking a permit. In 4420, we also have specifications about the Genetic Engineering Advisory Committee. So this committee was appointed on September of 1989. And in Rule 4420, it specifies the role of the committee. So basically, that committee had the purpose of reviewing permitting components, provide advice, and make recommendations concerning development, revision, and enforcement of any rule or any program initiated under these rules and the statutes that I mentioned. The Genetic Advisory Committee was comprised of members of industry, environmental groups, academic community, state agencies, and general public. However, right now that committee is no longer active. So what is coming? As I mentioned before, to date in Minnesota, we know that only ag-related GEOs have been released. However, we know that non-ag GEOs are in development. For instance, we have been engaging with researchers from the University of Minnesota who are developing an genetically engineered common carp. Sorry, a lot of letters. Genetically engineered common carp, which will serve as its own biocontrol agent to invasive common carp. So in here, you can see in the slide, in the blue colors are a couple projects that we know are coming to Minnesota, and in green, those are projects that we know are being applied in other states, could potentially come to Minnesota as well. So the next steps that we think EQB staff should be doing is to first investigate and understand federal and other state regulations related to non-agriculturally related GEOs, to investigate and understand future non-ag related GEOs projects that are coming to Minnesota, draft a hypothetical case scenario and where the board will need to exercise its authorities on the matter, and then come back during the fall of this year and present it to you so you can see like that hypothetical scenario being in place and you could understand better how to apply the rules. And if we need to update the rules since new technology has been, that technology keeps advancing and these rules are older than me. So yeah. So thank you for your attention. I'm here to answer any questions I can answer, write down the ones I may not be able to answer right now, but let me know.
Thank you, Chair Moreno. Any questions from board members? Commissioner Kessler.
I don't know, it's kind of a question. I appreciate thinking ahead, and I also appreciate the examples, because I wasn't entirely sure what we were talking about when you talk about genetically modified that would fall under the jurisdiction of EQB. I will say probably 10 plus years ago, EPA had a new mandate to delegated authorities under the Clean Water Act to create a pesticide general permit. It was like pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides. And we had to come up with a way to permit activities that were ongoing. Some of them relate to mosquitoes. I was asking Tom if he, it's good to call out that it's non-agricultural things. That general permit is odd because it spans the MPCA, Department of Ag, and the DNR, who oversees application of aquatic insecticides not pesticides, but weed control application within waters of the state. So there are examples of other permitting structures that are somewhat akin to this, and I wouldn't want to bite off something like that if we didn't absolutely do, but I also think it's really important to think proactively for a situation where you might need to do this. But like for the mosquito thing, I know we cover mosquito control under that general insecticide, pesticide, fungicide permit. I don't know if this type of mosquito control would qualify. So it would be good to look at, and maybe we've already done this, like how the potential organisms that might be envisioned here overlap
Hmm.
or are different from what is covered under that other permit.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I think it has to do with the technology that is used to create this organism. So in the case of mosquito, through genetic engineering, I think as far as I understand, it's the self-limiting technology where they, produce sterile males that go mate in the wild, and then there's either no progeny or the progeny is sterile and carry to the next generation, something like that. And I think there was some application of that in Florida for the Zika virus. And so I'm curious to also understand how Florida dealt with permitting that. And if something like that were to come to Minnesota, what work has been done to, like as you say, as you mentioned, to deal with these kinds of organisms. If it was non-genetically engineered mosquito, but if it is a genetically engineered mosquito, then it's these rules that would apply.
And then the only other kind of comment question I have is, great that we could potentially control some of these, but recognize that, to the Florida example, we're not the only ones dealing with invasive carp. So is the federal government thinking about this? Because I will tell you that when we were thinking about a general permit at the state level, part of our thought process was, well, is the federal government just going to create a general permit? Because then, if the whole point is not to be redundant, maybe we can just borrow theirs. I don't know if they've thought about it, but cool.
Yeah, I'm actually attending tomorrow a workshop by the researchers that are currently developing the GEO common carp, and I'm really excited to learn more about where they're at their developing process and trying to see where our regulatory framework will plug in and kind of have a better idea of how that would work, and see, including federal regulation as well.
Member Darkenberg.
Thank you, Chairman. So I appreciate Commissioner Kessler's observations across the board, and particularly the one that asks, is a GEO that is created to decrease the population or the threat of mosquitoes, is that an insecticide?
Mm-hmm.
A question I never thought of before, right? I mean, earlier today, I would have thought that the GEO is not an insecticide because I have a pretty narrow and uninformed imagination of what insecticide is, like some kind of chemical application or something. So I think that'd be a useful question to pursue. Like, what is the definition of insecticide under the existing regulatory framework? And does the framework that calls out GEOs mandate that they be considered outside of those existing frameworks?
Yeah.
So I think that's worth pursuing. And then the list of things that you had, I support that work to look into the federal frameworks. And I think the hypothetical case study, which presumably would be in the neighborhood of things that have been inquired about, would be a useful path so that, we're not trying to create a brilliant, elegant framework for things that we don't even know whether or not they exist, instead of pursuing it through those hypothetical and sort of almost known case studies, is a good idea. So I appreciate that. My question, which is not nearly as interesting as all of that is, do you happen to know when the advisory board was active? And do you happen to know what sort of advice it generated and delivered?
Yeah, so actually I have the sonar here of when all of this was happening, and this advisory committee was active during that period of time of the late 80s, like 89 to 91, 90 something, 92, I think. And their work was to work with all these different work groups and with the board to generate those recommendations that we read. And then they were also part of the stakeholder group, basically, like we're a group of different stakeholders that will help process the rules that were being made and advise the board into what was making sense and what wouldn't make sense. So that was their main work. And honestly, from reading the sonar, I don't know when it was disbanded or why it was disbanded, but I think that was their main purpose, and it was kind of like accomplished. And then a potential possible future step would be maybe convening a new one, if the board sees that fit in the future.
Thank you. So is that advisory board, like, as derived and described in statute or in rule, is it understood to be an ongoing thing, or was it understood to be a task force limited to its time?
I think 4420, if I mention it, and I have it here. 4420 does kind of like says that it could be an ongoing thing because it states their role. So it doesn't really, the language doesn't really say, and maybe I need to consult that with
Yeah,
the lawyer first before I say anything wrong, but my understanding is like that could be a tool that we could have, and it's stated in the rules that we could convene this advisory committee again. There is a process of how they did it in the sonar, how it was convened, and then that would be a resource that the board could have to advise on decisions, on future decisions on that. But yeah, it says, the role is to advise basically the board and to review rules and future steps of the program. So since the language says that, I would assume that means we could still, have a use for that.
Okay. And then, depending on how the language is worded, it could mandate the existence of that advisory. I don't know that, but that would be a question not for right now, but another thing to add to the list, kind of figure out.
Yeah.
Like, is this board supposed to exist? Is it presumed to exist? And either way,
Here
what
it
would the
is.
staff's recommendation be on reconvening?
So the language says the board or chair must provide guidance to the Genetic Engineering Advisory Committee in the form of a charge and through specific requests.
Okay.
And then talks about release review and program review. But yeah, that's a good question that we can explore.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Stroman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just identify myself since I'm on the screen. I'm Sarah Stroman, Commissioner at Minnesota DNR. I think a couple of thoughts that occurred to me when reading this. I mean, one is I think we should really take a look at the legislation and the rules. I mean, this dates back to 1989, and clearly the technology and the thinking around genetically engineered organisms, we're just in a very different place than what could have been imagined in 1989. And so I would caution against the board being too locked into what was envisioned then, as opposed to, based on current expertise, how would we suggest approaching this? So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is, one of the things I struggle with is really thinking about the different types of organisms in one framework. And a little bit to the point of the conversation we were having, right, that in the ag arena, those generally the Department of Ag has authorities, and so to regulate release of certain things, and so that's already covered. I would say for perhaps fish, DNR has stocking permits. There may be already regulatory authority that would not need additional. I'm really also intrigued by Commissioner Kessler's sort of questions on, depending on how we define insecticide, right? Maybe there are other ways that are covered. And so I think really examining the nexus between organisms that might be genetically engineered and already existing regulatory frameworks, and understanding if there are more situations beyond the agricultural one where there is already sufficient regulation and maybe not. And then I think what's going to be difficult, right, is presumably there are many more things that we can't imagine today that might exist in the future. And so thinking about those specific cases, as well as how do you create something that's flexible. But I really do see, one, a need to sort of update our thinking from 1989 on the subject, and two, to really make sure we are not creating regulatory redundancies based on at least the organisms we're aware of now, and thinking really carefully about, do we follow suit with how we approach things in the ag sector, or if there aren't already regulatory things, then what do we need to create? Sorry, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Stroman. Any other questions, comments from board members?
Well, I just say too, like, you know, with the ag, we have, you know, really good staff that have a lot of experience with that. And I don't know how much you've interacted with them, but I encourage you to work with some of them that have a lot of that experience in dealing with the USDA and some of the processes and everything. We met about it yesterday or Monday, just to kind of go through like everything that we have as it relates. We also worked on clarifying some of our own statutes this year and updating in the ag bill some of these statutes that hadn't been updated for a very, very long time and conform to the USDA. And so there's just a lot of good things to like visit about as you're putting together things for, and I appreciate you giving the examples. So like what, you know, what's coming, you know, I do a little bit about the carp, but other things as we think about, you know, mosquitoes are always interesting, you know, as we look, as Commissioner Kessler said. So, but yeah, I just encourage you. Denise, she was on listening. Denise, yes.
Thank you, Commissioner Peterson. Yes, definitely. We will be tapping into all the expertise from all the agencies to figure this out.
Yeah, thanks. Just a second. Assistant Commissioner Huff, I think you're next, and then we'll go to you.
Thank you. So one question I have, so you mentioned medicine as one of the areas of where this may be used. What is the jurisdiction then of EQB under these statutes? Do we know of how that would apply to, say, FDA approved either medication or devices?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. I saw it somewhere and I can't find it right now. I should have highlighted it. I think EQB would not have jurisdiction over medical GEO produced. So one example I can think of is how some vaccines are created that doesn't really take the release into the environment of a genetically engineered organism. Like the thing that is quote unquote released would be the vaccine, and that's not genetically engineered. So we wouldn't have any permitting requirement for that type of thing. So that's one example of a medical application that I can think of. But yeah, I mean, I would be curious to see if there would be like something medically related that will require a release into the environment of something, then that's something that I think we would have to talk about with MDH and but all the agencies that would have to be involved into that, because I think that an approach that I've seen most often is treating each case by case, right? Each case may have its own particular needs and requirements, and we just need to be prepared to deal with each case and not, you know, they're so unique. Some things are so unique that will require us to analyze them each case by case, basically.
Okay, thanks. I've asked our attorney to just kind of take a look because I don't know if the FDA would have primacy. In fact, I know there's a Supreme Court case weighing that right now between states' ability to regulate FDA approved medications. So I just think that might be an interesting, although as you say, it hasn't pertained yet, but it might. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Public Member Katzenberger, do you have a comment?
Yeah, so thanks. So yeah, so I wanted to reemphasize Member Bauenkemper's idea that we should, you know, plan this on realistic scenarios, things we know that are in play right now. But I also think it should be broad enough and it should be structured enough, because I can imagine somebody coming up with a genetically modified organism or genetically engineered organism for 30 $30 or for 80-inch muskies, right? And they're going to want to release these into the nature so that they can improve, you know, the DNR's kind of effects. And so as we're thinking about these things, we really need to be conscientious about not just what's, you know, to control mosquitoes and to control invasive species, but other reasons people might want to bring these in. And then even on mosquitoes, I can think you lower the mosquito population, you affect the bat population, right? And so how does that all impact, and how do we collect the science, and how are we guided in our decisions when there's all these complex ecological issues? And then public opinion, right? Which is going to be strong as well.
Yeah, good comment. Seeing any further questions before we move on? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item will be an update on the continuous improvement project as part of the environmental review program. We're going to have an update from two presenters, Kayla Walsh, Karen Guided. Pronunciation of it.
That's good.
So Kayla from staff of VQB and Karen Guided from the Minnesota Department of Management and Budget are going to walk us through changes made since the last month's meeting, and then we'll have some board discussion. Welcome, Kayla and Karen.
Well, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members and members of the public. Again, my name is Kayla Walsh, and I am the Environmental Review Program Administrator here at EQB. And it's good to be with you all today to present these updates on our continuous improvement effort. So we are building this process to help identify and prioritize any changes and improvements that we can make to the environmental review and its program effectiveness overall. So the goal for our meeting today is to refine and finalize the prioritization matrix. So we will be asking these questions at the end of the presentation. Do the draft criteria and matrix design meet the needs of the board? Are they ready for the staff to continue on with scoring the improvements through the matrix? So we have, I want to emphasize that the board is not being asked to make any decisions or approvals today, but there will be time for discussion after our presentation. And since the April board meeting, we have taken in a lot of helpful feedback, including all of your feedback from the board and from our interagency continuous improvement team. And so there have been some changes that happened since the board packet was published, and we will be highlighting those changes in today's presentation as well. So we are hoping to review the updated criteria and matrix with you and make sure that it's ready to move forward with. As a general recap, we've shown this slide in the past, but the process for continuous improvement was launched in January in earnest, and we've been working in partnership with MAD Consultants. And so MAD conducted a lot of research and engagement to identify what is currently going well with our program and what improvements we might need to make. And then also to identify what components would in altogether help us to define program effectiveness. So that's what this diagram is really trying to show, is that our research and our engagement has been combined and collated with the board feedback and our interagency team feedback to create our list of improvements and criteria for program effectiveness. So throughout today's presentation, please feel free to refer to board packet page 10. That includes a memo on this agenda item. The memo includes two attachments. The first contains a second version of the draft matrix and criteria definitions. And like I mentioned, the packet was published on May 5th. So there are some changes that we made after May 5th that we will highlight in our presentation today. And then the second attachment is our list of improvements, and that came through the research and the engagement. And these improvements it's a very long list. It's really only meant for you to skim through to help show you the wide breadth and the range in the topics and specificity of the comments that we received. Today's conversation focuses mainly on the matrix and criteria again, but that is only one step in this broader continuous improvement process that we are proposing. So generally, we have heard positive feedback about these steps of running the process annually. ensuring that the improvements do apply to EQB before putting them through the matrix, and then using the matrix to order those priorities. And then staff would consider the logistical considerations of implementing things such as the validity of the suggestion, the time and the resources required to execute those ideas. So the next step on step 6 is bolded because it is an additional idea. It's a new idea. We think that the process would also benefit from having ERIS, the Environmental Review Implementation Subcommittee, take a first look at that staff recommendation and the prioritized list of improvements and have a first chance at sequencing them. And so then ERIS would present that sequencing to the board for final approval. So that can be a point of discussion later on during the discussion portion if that is something that you would like to talk through as well. And EQB staff would be doing all of these steps up until ERIS makes that final determination on the sequencing. And so this is the same as last meeting, just a little bit more detail on those 6 process steps. The bar underneath is again meant to demonstrate that staff would always be accepting ideas throughout the year for improvements, and we would keep a transparent running list of those improvements online that's open to the public to see. And the step 2 of the scoping would really be very minimal. If an idea pertains solely to directives that are outside of EQB's purview, like permitting at a singular agency, then we would not run those ideas through the matrix. And nor would we ever want to, if it's something we would never want to tackle as EQB, we wouldn't run it through. So the initiatives that pass that brief scoping exercise would be ordered by the matrix, where we evaluate the improvements and how well they meet the criteria of effectiveness. And then once we have that ordering, that would again be based on how they contribute to program effectiveness. So if something meets all of our criteria, it scores 2s across the board, we would then plan for its implementation. And that's step 5 of EQB staff taking really careful and critical look at the resource needs to implement things, the staffing, the timing, and then we would present all of that information to ERIS and to the board for an informed decision on, of all of these very important projects, which ones do we want to do first, second, and third. So the whole process is designed to be very transparent and equip you all with the best information possible to make informed decisions. We did take some time to think a little bit more about that step 5 planning and step 6 sequencing. So to dive into that aspect a little bit more, these are the types of things that we would want to consider at that point in the process. So staff would start asking these types of questions. What might be the size and the timeline for the project? Does EQB have the authority to take required action, or do we need legislative action first? Does it hinge on a previous project going through first? Do we need additional budgeting or time or authority and those types of things? And all of that information, including the results of the matrix, would then go forward to ERIS and the board. So lastly, before I turn it over to Karen to discuss the changes in more detail, I do want to take a moment to talk about the tribal recommendations and working with tribes on the CI process. When the EQB reached out to tribes, we asked for their improvements to our program. So the comments from tribes pertain only to that list of improvements, and they did not give feedback on the overall continuous improvement process steps or the matrix. But tribes' comments are pertaining to the improvements, and we received some comments from tribes during this engagement, but we've also received comments from tribes from recent engagements in the recent past. So we're using all of that information, both past and present, in this effort. And some of the ideas that came up really include designing an alternative petition process so that there's a government to government process happening and tribes do not need to collect 100 signatures. There's also the idea of developing guidance on best practices for tribal engagement in environmental review and best practices for how responsible governmental units can work with tribes. And there's also an idea for tribes to define cultural resources with the EQB, help to co-define that, and then add that as a new mandatory category potentially to address tribal cultural resources. And Director Nuschler is now reaching out to tribes for additional ideas to help refine our understanding of comments that we've already been sent to us, and then also to get tribes' feedback on any of the recommendations that impact tribes that did not come directly from them. And we did receive quite a few improvements that did pertain to tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. We also heard the need for EQB to have a very consistent and meaningful coordination policy, as Director Nuschler mentioned. And so improving EQB's tribal relations and engagement are a clear priority and need. And we want to respect the sovereignty of tribes. And as such, tribal concerns should be given significant weight, and any ideas from tribes would be considered concurrently in a separate list and in parallel to the matrix. And we do plan to continue engaging with MNTEC, Minnesota Tribal Environmental Council, and reaching out to coordinate with tribes on this process and building the larger coordination policy. So in the future, we will present more information on that progress on the coordination policy to the board. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen and have her introduce herself and dive into the specific matrix updates. Thanks.
Thank you, Kayla. Good afternoon. My name is Karen Gatus. I'm a senior management consultant at Management Analysis and Development at MMB. Kayla framed an overview of the continuous improvement process and our current steps, and I'm going to be diving more into the details around the updates with the criteria and the prioritization matrix. As Kayla mentioned, we obtained feedback from the board, as well as we have been working very closely with the interagency continuous improvement team. They have helped us both at a detailed level with editing and revisions to the criteria. They've also been doing some testing of scoring and looking at the overall design of the prioritization matrix. We are going to have quite a few updates for you on the criteria and the matrix. As Kayla mentioned, the board packet went out on May 5th, and we're now at May 17th. I believe we've met with the continuous improvement team, I know once, if not twice, and we've also gotten a lot of feedback. We created an online whiteboard called a mural, and they gave us feedback that way, and we've also integrated the board feedback. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what we heard, and then we'll talk about the application of that feedback. You all mentioned that, some of you mentioned that 12 criteria seems like a lot for people who are trying to apply the criteria. Combining criteria may inherently weight values. The tribal coordination piece was addressed in the previous slide. And where is that accounted for in the six-step CI process? There was also feedback from a few people at the board meeting, a few members, about environmental review can both directly lead to better outcomes and enrich our understanding of the environment, which is intrinsically good. We want to embrace both of those facets. And as well, there's a need to test the matrix before knowing if the 12 criteria are too many and balancing the criteria. We have reduced the number of criteria from 12 to 9 criteria. You can see some of the sub bullets there, and I'll also give you a few more verbal updates. We removed public engagement and grouped it with inclusivity, while recommending that it also be highlighted in the EQB's overall strategic plan. understandable, that was one of the criteria, was retitled to user-friendly. Removed transparent and grouped it with accessible. We also removed programmatic integrity. There's 3 other updates, but I'm going to address those with the next slide where you can actually read the criteria. So there's 3 additional updates that have come through between May 5th and May 17th, but I'll go through those when you can actually see the criteria. The definitions were updated based on board member feedback more broadly and CI team feedback more specifically. Also, with the scoring, there's now a scale of 0, 1, 2. And currently the criteria is not weighted against one another. Here is an overview of the updated draft criteria. And a few additional updates. For scientific integrity, reputable was added to that definition. With inclusivity, that references environmental justice area definition and statute. Removed access to information and accessibility because that felt duplicative with scientific integrity. And then in the quality assurance criteria, we specified that it means EQB's ability to verify. One aspect of the new matrix is that it is aligned with the rule objectives. Here are the A through E, the 5 items. And then we show you visually here how the 9 criteria are evenly divided up between objective A, objective B, and objectives D and E. With criteria for providing usable information, you can see that under that umbrella or that bucket, there's 3 criteria. And then for objective B, again, there's 3 criteria with an asterisk that environmental justice areas has the same definition as given in the statute. And then in a similar manner, these 3 criteria, consistency, quality assurance, and accountability, align with criteria for outcomes. The scoring with the draft prioritization matrix. So I'll go through this one a little more slowly because this one has changed more. Each criteria would be scored using a scale of 0, 1, 2 points. And of course, there's the alternative of the binary option, which we presented at the last meeting. The scoring, the phrasing of the scoring questions has changed since the board packet publication. So the questions are currently phrased, does an improvement directly increase a criterion as defined below? When I show you the, maybe I'll just toggle ahead to the full matrix. So this is how it looks. There's the 3 chunks or 3 areas, the definitions, there's the scoring. And I'll go back to, we have a few examples. So picture the scoring update. Does an improvement directly increase a criterion as defined below? Or that would apply to the second example, which is EQB votes to approve a tribal consultation and coordination policy that includes direction for environmental review. Under inclusivity, it would get 2 points. Then with the middle scoring item, does an improvement indirectly increase a criterion as defined below? We have the example that you can see above about add a question on the EAW form that asks project proposers and RGUs to describe the public engagement process. Now, Kayla is going to talk about some of the testing that's taken place because board members were mentioning that it's important to test this concept, test it. Right now the testing is in an Excel spreadsheet. We've taken this matrix that you can see and we've plugged it into an Excel spreadsheet to test different improvements. And Kayla's going to go through a few slides on the testing and scoring of the improvements.
So our environmental review staff at EQB did some of this testing and we really learned a lot through that experience. And we ran these 3 well-known improvements through the matrix for a start. The first is updating the EAW form to include prompts for greenhouse gas emission quantification. The second is to develop a new mandatory EIS category related to greenhouse gas emissions. And the third is to amend the decision criteria to be based on climate assessment data. So these are the 3 final recommendations made to ARIS from the interagency climate technical team. And the board decided to move forward with changes to the EAW form first. And the other 2 ideas would require more intensive time. They would require rule change, but the EAW form updates only needed board approval. And that's why one of the reasons why it went forward. So our scores for here are very interesting. So we wanted to walk through them with you all. So of course, the first idea was just implemented in last December. And when we scored the EAW form, it actually came out the lowest. And there's a couple reasons for that. And I want to preface this with the disclaimer that we recognize this is inherently a subjective exercise. There's a lot of assumptions that we're testing and formulating as we work through this. So we're finding all the assumptions we can agree upon as we are interpreting these criteria. But we gave this 1 point for the first 3 criteria. Mostly because our reasoning was that folks could technically already talk about greenhouse gas emissions in the EAW form prior to adding this prompt. And solely having the question does not mean that it is required for folks to fill out. It's still at the discretion of the RGU. So we did concede that it provided some consistency though, and although we couldn't require that the same data be used in answering the question each time. So that's why we gave it 1 point for consistency. And we did believe that the question could indirectly lead to more accountability to the public and to the environment. So gave it 1 point there as well. So in comparison, the last one, amending the decision criteria to be based on climate assessment data, is making climate a required consideration and really baking it into programmatic decisions. So through our deliberations as a team, we agreed that there was more of a guarantee that that greenhouse gas emissions information would be usable, used, and measured by the program. So this isn't to say that updating the EAW form wasn't important, because it very much is, and it's a huge accomplishment. But I think this just shows us that there are several really important competing ideas for our attention, and that they're all very important improvements, but this matrix is going to help us give us one piece of information to help us understand the overall effectiveness to multiple different criteria to the program. And the EAW form ended up meeting the fewest number of criteria for an effective program in the way that we have it laid out currently. So we also tested out a representative sampling of the improvements that we gathered through the engagement process. And the next slide will show those improvements as they were written to us. We didn't really change the phrasing of them at all. And the total scores that they received when we ran through this exercise. So we tested 10 improvements, but want to call your attention specifically to some examples that scored high, medium, and low. And again, we didn't change the phrasing or the wording of them much at all because we really wanted to be true to the intent of the person who submitted the comments. So this slide only reflects our EQB team's scores, but right now, as Karen mentioned, we are also working with the interagency team and having them score the same improvements and learning from discussions with them as well. So this slide, the two improvements with the scores of 10 are, what they have in common is that they're both focused on scientific integrity and improving processes. And they're very results oriented. The improvement that scored a 5 in the middle there is about providing training. And while that could potentially be very helpful, there's nothing in that sentence that ensures that the training is consistent or required or followed. And so that's an example of an idea that might be too narrow and would need some further refinement before we could run it through the matrix. So we would first need to better understand the problem before we knew a pathway forward in that example. And in the future, when we are asking for improvements, we want to be really prescriptive in how we ask for them so that they're matrix ready. For example, they're ready to go through the matrix. We don't have to do much editing or follow up on them. And then the final example on the bottom of the screen, I want to call your attention to because it's one that staff felt was very important and very compelling. It says that MEPA should be amended to allow that judicial appeals for projects be held either in the county where the project is located or in the county where the principal office of the RGU is located. So to us, it very clearly ranked at 2 for accountability, but it just didn't hit on any other criteria very much. And so this is a case where a couple things could happen. The staff could continue like planning for implementing that project and make a case and make a justification for it to ARIS saying it only received a 3, but we felt like it was very important. Or ARIS, where the board could prioritize anything that received a 2 in accountability, and they could prioritize working on all of the accountability improvements. And also ARIS or the board could always request that staff work on an idea regardless of the scoring in the matrix. So even though the last one is important, it might not be as impactful overall to all of the criteria in whole in summation. And there are also a lot of suggestions around judicial appeals that we received. So we could also take a look at all of those suggestions together and tackle it in one larger project and considering various inputs and devising a larger plan to tackle that one topic. So I'm happy to discuss the scores in more detail during the discussion portion, but just wanted to give you a highlight of how our testing is going with the matrix. But hand it back over to Karen for next steps.
Thank you. The next steps between the May and June board meeting are similar to what has taken place since the April to May board meeting. The EQB staff are going to review the matrix and criteria to reflect the board feedback, do additional testing on improvements. The interagency team will also be testing improvements and providing final review on the criteria and matrix before it goes back to the board. For the review, the final review of the criteria and definitions, design and scoring of the matrix. At the June board meeting, we'll also do a recap of the continuous improvement project, as well as talk about considerations for implementation and planning for the improvements, moving forward with the improvements. That's what we have for our presentation. We're moving into the discussion section. For today's conversation, we are going to be resuming the standard EQB discussion procedure where the chair will facilitate the discussion questions on the next slide. And these are the ones that Kayla led with and talking about your feedback on the draft criteria definitions, design, scoring, and test results. So thank you very much. I will hand it over to Chair Martin, unless, I don't know if, are you still filling in or is there someone else?
Well, that's a good question.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? This is
Oh, she's-
Nancy.
Okay,
Daubenberger.
Chair Daubenberger is here. Oh, great.
So I will relinquish my role now, I think. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks.
Good job.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And I regret that I had a conflict with the first part of this meeting and I just jumped on. But thank you, Karen, for going through that information. And so, yeah, this is the part of the meeting where we want to hear from you. And first question here, do the following meet the needs of the board? And we'll start out with the draft criteria definitions. Well, we could take these all at once too. So if folks have thoughts on all of this, go ahead and just raise your hand or jump in. But then the matrix design scoring, and then of course the test results. So is it ready for the next step of having EQB staff running improvements through the matrix? So on that, do we feel like these meet the needs? So please either raise your hand or jump in.
Jump in, or what do I do?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. This is Joseph Bauerkemper, a public member. I have a question about the criterion in the matrix regarding objective C, which is not associated with any of the three bundles and has to do with the designation of RGUs, in my understanding. And I'm wondering, that presumably could be an area that could be improved, or we might receive guidance or suggestions to improve how the EQB interprets the rules, or even what the rules are regarding designation of RGUs. So, and first I should say, Karen and Kayla and the staff, thank you so much. This has been really informative presentation. So I have a lot of questions and I'm excited about the process. So much gratitude for the really good work y'all are doing. So can you say a little bit about Objective C and whether or not it didn't get in there just because none of the criteria happened to resonate with it? Or is it not something that's seen as relevant to this process?
Great question.
Yeah, if you want to take that, that'd be great.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we're being the bucketing of the criteria was something that came out of conversations, and how do we think about the balancing of the criteria, and the Objective C felt very prescriptive and not related to a general broad concept, but it was a task in my mind of assign RGUs. And so that's why it didn't appear in one of the buckets. I think it would definitely still be something we would want to consider improving for sure. I definitely don't want to leave that out. But it just didn't feel like a higher level concept. So that's why it doesn't appear there, but I'm definitely open to other interpretations or changing that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I don't have any suggestions, but it, just jumped out. So
Yeah, like why?
I'm curious.
Thank you for that. And others.
I'll jump in. This is Ken Foster, public member. And I just want to second what Joseph said about this has been a really great process. And I really appreciate the changes that have been made and the clear organization of this. And I just want to call out, I really like the way that you put these down to 9, but then put them in those 3 buckets. Because initially I was concerned that we take public engagement out, but that's really important. But then it makes it clear that 4, 5, and 6 are all related to improving public engagement. So I think that's a really effective way to think about it. I wanted to ask a question about the difference between directly and indirectly improving. And if you could say a little bit more about, how this works when we think about it in terms of indirect improvement, because in some ways, the examples you gave were somehow about it may result in an increase, whereas the direct is that it seems like it definitely will result in an increase in that criterion. And indirectly seems harder kind of for me to wrap my head around is how that's going to play with those. So if you could say a little bit more about that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. When we were thinking about that and we're working on that with the interagency team as well, that has come up, and is direct and indirect the right phrases to use? We've talked about fully or partially instead of direct and indirect. So I think it's being thought about in those same ways. An example of something that is directly targeting public engagement might be, we had an improvement of sending postcards to everyone who lives within 10 miles of a project. So that is directly focused on public engagement. It could also indirectly result in more consistency, but it's not directly oriented towards that. So that was how the direct and indirect language sort of started. But I think another way to think about it would be, is it fully or targeted on one criteria, or is it partially going to impact another criteria, but that wasn't the main point of the improvement?
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. It is difficult because different criteria have potentially different answers. So directly, it could be as simple as directly, or, I mean, have an or, an either or kind of thing in there. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Good discussion. All right, I am looking for hands, and I'm sorry, I do have a hard time seeing them on WebEx as I go through the participant list. It seems like when someone starts talking, then their little box will light up with a hand on it. But if I'm missing you and you have your hand up, just jump in.
So Chair Daubenberger, this is Joseph Bauerkenberg again. Thanks. So I have another question that maybe plays off of what Ken was saying. With the MIPA example, and again, thank you so much for doing the tests. Like, that really illuminates things, doesn't it? Like, it really kind of helps to make this three-dimensional, if not more than that. So the MIPA recommendation on the venue for the judicial appeals is a really interesting one. And so I want to know, as you said, right now, the putting things through the matrix is an exercise in textual analysis, really. Like, you're looking at the recommendation as written through whatever submission process, right? Had that recommendation been elaborated, where whoever was making the recommendation maybe made an argument on why they think the venue matters, it may have explicitly connected to other criteria. At least I'm thinking that's probably the case. If they think that it matters that this be held in a county venue, or a particular county venue, there are going to be some implications, if not explicit connections, to those other things. So my question is, like, as we pursue this, do you anticipate maintaining that kind of textual analysis principle, or do you think it might evolve toward a more conceptual analysis? And if it is going to be a textual analysis, then we probably need to do like the teacherly thing of like giving the rubric out so that people know like what they're writing for the test or whatever. So what are your thoughts on that, as having done this exercise?
One thing that came up in the continuous improvement team meeting yesterday is that the improvements are not framed consistently. So there is going to need to be some work on how the improvement statements are going to be framed. As with what the data we have now, and then also, as Kayla was mentioning, in the future, framing the collection system in a way so that the improvements will come in the most useful or consistent manner. So I'm not sure if that's addressing your question exactly, but that was a realization when we were going through scoring with the agency representatives, that some, for example, some statements started with a verb, some statements started with the noun, something said should, like you saw in one of the slides. So that is a challenge in scoring the improvements when just basic consistent grammar or consistent sentence structure is not there.
To add to that, I think in the future, if we're asking for improvements through Engagement HQ, it would be really easy to frame it and say, I would like to improve ...
Right.
Have the person fill out their improvement. And then they can also select on a criteria list. I think it would get I think it would hit these 5 criteria that you list. And that could start us off on a little bit better of a footing, and maybe having some follow-up with people, maybe not making it anonymous so that we can refine the intent of their idea with them too, so that we're not spending a lot of time doing that guesswork. I think would be really helpful for us as staff, and making sure we're getting the most out of the matrix. And also we are kind of creating some assumptions that we can use when we're dealing with certain mechanisms. So if everything is rulemaking, or if everything is falling into the same idea of let's update a mandatory category, maybe all of those kind of have a baseline scoring because they're all the same mechanism. And then if there's some nuances to them, the scores would change slightly. So that's one idea that we've been tackling, and like thinking through that same thing.
You might could ask them why, like, I don't know, you're gonna end up with a convoluted submission form, but if they tell you what criteria, that's one thing, but if they can make a concise case.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right, thanks. And then I see a hand up from Public Member Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start out apologizing to the fellow board members of missing last month. So I may be asking things that you have discussed already. And I also want to thank staff for the analysis to date. But I have a question and possible follow-up. I am missing in the first table there that compares the criterion to objectives. Objective E is about duplication. I don't see that being addressed myself, so I'm asking where you see that coming in on that.
Thank you for the question. So I agree, it's not very clear. We did put under the consistency definition to eliminate ambiguities and promote comparability. So that it got a little lost in the eliminate ambiguities. I think we could add something to that to be really clear about the duplication.
Thank you. I guess I can see a little overlap there, but and my follow-up is 9 criteria are a lot, and your example of the one you thought was very important, improvement, not scoring high overall, is an outcome of sometimes using indices for broad range endeavor kinds of things. But I was a little surprised not to see a criteria having something to do with streamlining. And it kind of comes back to Commissioner Peterson's comment a few meetings ago about concerns about the cost of environmental review when we were considering the climate change inputs, changes to the form. I get it, and I believe that the board would have conversations if any of these get to the stage where we advance them to implementation about the cost to the regulated community or to others to complete these improvements or so forth. But it also occurs to me that some of the suggestions might themselves be suggestions to improve or to streamline the efficiency of the whole environmental review process. So I'm wondering where that might come in the criteria. And I'll go offline now.
Thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go and pull up our definitions page. If I can find, let's see. So under user friendliness, we do say ease or efficiency to thoroughly and accurately complete reviews. So that is where efficiency and streamlining did get a little bundled into that user friendliness. So in terms of, we want it to be user friendly for the public, for project proposers, for RGUs, basically for anybody who's interacting with the environmental review program. And if that's something that we can tease out a little bit more, I'm definitely open to suggestions.
Thank you, Karen. And so Public Member Nelson, did you have any thoughts on that? Further thoughts on that?
I don't know that I do. I mean, I could always drop the term streamlined in there, but I didn't want to wordsmith. But I was kind of wondering if that gap had, if it's just my thing to perceive it, or whether any of the other board members, particularly, Commissioner Peterson, if that kind of came up to them.
Does anyone else want to?
Sorry,
Go ahead, Commissioner Peterson.
Yeah, no, I appreciate those comments. I just think of, anytime we can do that, and I look at this more as somebody who's trying to attract businesses to our state, and I just think of companies I've met in the last 2 weeks that are, looking at locating here in Minnesota, and what's the process. So we're looking at the Dakotas or Wisconsin or Iowa or Kentucky, and we look at what, okay, they, in general, the companies know they're gonna have to jump through more hoops to come to Minnesota, but I think that we talk about, the staff and regulatory approach to helping people get through those processes is the more we can do that as we're trying to sell Minnesota as well, to bring a lot of, frankly, green companies here. But they'll go to other states, if they're, when they look at this process, because it can slow down the permitting process, immensely, as you're looking at this. And then the cost too is important. So, and I'm not against any of that or anything, but I do look at that as we're, as our, piece for the department is, looking at that. And so I appreciate that when we can have that in there. And I don't know, like streamline has to be in there or anything, but I do appreciate, because this is a little different, and than other states around us have, and so when we're, working on that, and I'm not just talking about, businesses out of state either, that are coming in. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Commissioner Peterson. So I think Member Conor Steenberg had his hand up, but then I think it looks like it's down right now. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add in there?
I don't really. I was just gonna make a comment about, there's so much focus, I think, in our society about speaking, and I'm really impressed with the listening that went on over the last couple of meetings and how staff really heard what was being voiced here and reacted to that in a constructive way. So I just wanted to offer that praise to the staff for the work they did here.
Thank you, Member Conor Steenberg. Right, and then Commissioner Stroman has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. And I'm in a little bit of the same situation as Member Nelson. I was not at the last meeting, and so I may have missed something, but I just want to check on the process that's laid out in our memo here. So the way the steps run, there are 6 steps to ensure improvements suggested apply to the EQB, then use the prioritization matrix, order the list, and then staff determine validity, time, resources, et cetera, to execute. And I'm just wondering if there is some validity filter being applied to this list other than whether or not it applies to EQB. And specifically, I'm looking at things like there's a suggestion here that says, accept science, acknowledge that industry is driven by money and legal loopholes, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to argue with the statement. Clearly, that person believes that's a suggestion, but that is not something that the EQ, I don't believe that's a continuous improvement step for environmental review. There are others that I think similarly come from certainly valid places of advocacy, but they are places of advocacy and assumptions. And I think I just have a question about process of whether we are going to go through the time of actually scoring things that really, when you read them, they're not continuous improvement steps, nor are they things that are going to be productive for the EQB to address an environmental review. So just curious about how we're dealing with the list in that way.
Thank you, Commissioner. That's a great question, and I should have spoke to that earlier. Not everything on the attachment B would be run through the list. Some of those comments we said, thank you very much. We are going to use that to inform the criteria that we're building. So we would take that accept science comment, and we would that it is showing up in us saying that scientific integrity is a criteria. So that's how we would handle that. So no, that would not go through the matrix, and staff right now are taking some time to make sure that the improvements that go through the matrix make enough sense for the criteria to be applied to them in a meaningful way. So we're whittling that list down a little bit before it'll go through the matrix. And then to your question about the validity and that taking place after running the matrix, we do want to make sure that if an idea scores really high, that it's going to be the best solution to a problem, sort of getting back to Member Bauerkemper's point about asking why are we doing this improvement? We want to kind of keep asking those why statements and making sure that that improvement that ranked high, just because it ranked high, doesn't mean we can't do something even better or add to it or do something in a more meaningful way. We want to ask where that opinion or idea is coming from. So that's also sort of a validity filter that we wanted to work toward. So hopefully that helps answer your question, but please let me know if I didn't.
That's helpful. And I think for me, it would be helpful to see, which ones ultimately get run through that matrix. And then I do think it's important, right, for both the staff and the board to have some time, I appreciate the point, just because something ranks high to the matrix does not mean it is practicable to actually implement as a continuous improvement suggestion. And so, I think just making sure that that's part of the process, which I think is what I understood you just say it will be, then I'm
Yes. So at the June meeting, there's going to be more discussion about the implementation, because we've spent a lot of time on this middle part. There's the initial filter, like Kayla was talking about, but we're in the middle portion of this process, which is the matrix and the criteria. At the June meeting, there will be discussion about implementation, about feasibility, effort, impact. And that I don't think has been built out completely. So in the slide that's on the screen right now, staff determined validity. That's part of the front end validity, but there's also the time, the resources, the impact, the effort. That still needs to be considered. We will discuss that at the June meeting.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it was more the validity piece, right? If something isn't valid and it isn't something that is implementable, then why would we go through the exercise of prioritizing it? And it could potentially score really high, but it actually isn't, right, something that is valid to be used. So that's why I was just questioning to make sure I understood the process there, because I think it just helps us to understand the matrix and the criteria and understanding what it's going to be applied to and how it's going to be applied and how it's going to be used as a decision tool going forward. So I appreciate that.
We should make it a little more apparent, I think. So it's, so it's more on the front end, make it more visual. So thank you for the comment, Commissioner.
Chair Delmenberger, I have a couple questions.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, thank you for this great work. Just two things. So one of the things that occurred to me when I saw the new scoring criteria, 0, 1, and 2, which is, it basically gives you the opportunity to say this either directly or indirectly improves or increases a criterion, or it doesn't affect it at all. Did you think about, I'm not sure you should do this, but it just occurred to me, did you think about having a -1, like where some proposed improvement, maybe negatively impacts one criteria, but that could still be outweighed by something else. So like just thinking about that, and this is sort of getting to the example before about user friendliness, like maybe there would be an improvement that like actually makes environmental review less user friendly or less accessible, but contributes so much to scientific integrity or environmental protection that we want to do it anyway. Or the inverse, somebody's proposing something that will be great for user friendliness, but too, so it gets points there, but too much compromises scientific integrity or something like that. So that's just a thought, and I don't know if a lot of people suggested greenhouse gas life cycle accounting. I've been working some with that recently. That's pretty complex stuff, and you're often dealing with a model, like the Argonne Greed model is often used for life cycle accounting. That's, not easy to get your arms around. So that could be an example of one that, makes things a little less accessible, but, we decide is worthwhile for scientific integrity or something. So I'm just curious, that was my first question, whether you thought about negative criteria, negative scoring, I mean.
That's a great thought experiment. And we have heard that, I think, from the interagency team as well. Somebody had that idea. And so we're exploring that with them and what that would do to the scoring. So what point well made.
And then the other thought was, it does seem, I guess people have already pointed out, like the different improvements that are included in the packet they range so much that it seems like it will be a challenging exercise to go through that list. But one of the things that you presented, how the added climate questions to the EAW in your hypothetical exercise got a 5, and like that, in our view, that was a really important improvement. But had this process been in place before that happened, and like we looked at dozens of other improvements, and there were some that got an 8 or a 10, would we not have done that? Or would we have put it out 10 years because there's a lot of other things we should do first that rank higher? Like how would you deal with that level of, there were a lot of people pushing for that, and there were some people that were against it, but how would you deal with that kind of, I guess, that kind of decision that has to be made that maybe goes beyond the scoring criteria as well?
If I may, Madam Chair, I'm going to jump in on this one because one of the things that I said to the team is sort of, we may need to end up in some ways grouping things about what do we need to do to get this done, because I think what we were finding is that things that impose requirements like rank higher because they ensure they happen, but those are also the things that take rulemaking or legislation or more resources and a longer process. So we may end up like trying to group things in some way, like to understand what level of process they need to be accomplished. And then I think as part of that sequencing, we'll be thinking about, well, what can we do from these different buckets of levels of work? That's how I'm thinking about it. And I think we can talk more about that in the sequencing thing. But yes, I think it shows that there there are things that really would help, but they're big lifts.
Can I follow up on that? So I just want to follow.
Certainly.
And I think, I love this, by the way, and I think that the categories are great. I think what it does is it shows where the EQB priorities are. So like if you take what people have submitted in the past, they didn't know what the priorities were, so they submitted things and now we're grading them against priorities that they didn't know about. But the next round, they will know about the priorities. So for example, something that might have scored a 5 previously, they might think, oh, I want to do this, but a priority is inclusivity, and I didn't include inclusivity in my proposal. So now maybe I should think about how I can improve inclusivity as I'm proposing an improvement. So I think you're going to get double benefit in future iterations. So applying this to past is a great exercise, but I think it's going to be even better in the future.
Thank you for that comment. And I think the next hand up I saw was Public Member Nelson. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a similar observation to Commissioner Stroman in looking at some of the stuff that was submitted. Not so much just validity, but kind of what it appeared to me, and many people didn't understand environmental review in submitting their comments. And a lot of comments were either they questioned the permit decision, or had specific things that they didn't like, those types of things. And so, you know, I think there's more than just validity for staff to go through on these. But my question is, so in what we consider for this process, environmental review, does that include the permit decisions by others, or is it just really the production of the documents and the acceptability by the RGU, the decision?
Thank you. Thank you, member. We're really focusing on the Environmental Quality Board's Environmental Review Program Authority and not on individual agency permitting.
But if I might add, though, that being said, one of the objectives is usability, and I think we would sort of conceptualize that as, is the data useful, or is the information useful throughout all the other processes that are supported, but focused on the data that would come in through environmental review, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Thank you for that. All right, and then I think the next hand up is Board Member Foster. Go ahead.
Thank you. The comments here and the discussion has been really illuminating. I just wanted to note that it brings me back to kind of the fundamental idea behind this, as I understand it, is that this matrix and these criteria provide a tool for us to use. And at each step, there's judgment entering in. And so I think as we finalize it, making it very, kind of what some other board members and commissioners are saying, and making it very clear, where and when, what kinds of judgments will enter into that. And so that UAW, adding climate to the EAW only scored a 5, but it's something that's relatively easy to do. And so it's something that would get picked up on. So I think beyond just the matrix itself, having kind of the not the talking points, but the explanation of here's where we're going to enter in with our judgments based on these ideas. I just think it's going to be it's really going to fulfill what we want it to do, provide us this tool that's going to help structure things without overly constraining us, that we have to do one thing or have to do another thing. So again, I think the judgment part is what in the future we can kind of tease out a little more in writing. But otherwise, again, this is a very promising, very good, process that we've had so far.
Thank you for that. All right, and I am not seeing any hands up on my participant list at the moment, but let me just check with you, Executive Director Nuschler. Do you see any hands there or in the room, on your screen or in the room?
We do not.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we wrap this up then? And I also just want to thank, well, Kayla and Karen and your team for the continued work on this. I mean, that was a tremendous amount of work to take all the input from the last meetings, and boil it down to this nice matrix with the criteria definitions and the scoring, and really looking forward to continued discussion on this next month. Sounds like we'll be talking about implementation. So I think that'll be a very good discussion as well. So with that, why don't we go ahead and move on to the next item in the agenda, and that is the public comment period. So if you have a public comment, then you'll raise your hand in WebEx, and I'll ask Executive Director Nuschler to help me with watching for hands too. But we'll call on those who signed up in person first, and then anybody who's raising their hand in WebEx. So Executive Director Nuschler, do we have anyone who is signed up in person?
No, Madam Chair, we do not have any public members with us here in the room, but I believe we do have some hands on the WebEx. We are going to actually just ask Jesse if he would tell us whose hands are up.
Sure, Chair Domberg, we have Amelia Voss. Amelia, you can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you and hello, my name is Amelia Voss. I'm an attorney at Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And for those of you that haven't met me, there's some new citizen members. I'm an environmental attorney, and so I'm someone who interacts with Minnesota's environmental review program almost on a daily basis. And I just had a few thoughts as this discussion on the matrix has unfolded. The first thought is that the matrix criteria are crafted around the objectives in Rule 4410-0300 subpart 4, but those objectives are implementing the part of the rule that's immediately above it, which is the purpose. And the purpose says that environmental review is all about how we balance human activity and the environment and protect the environment and provide information about significant environmental issues of a proposed project. And so one thought I have about the matrix criteria is just whether there should be perhaps a slightly greater emphasis on the environmental protection component, or how a proposal would help further uncover what significant environmental issues are for a project, since that's the overarching purpose that those objectives actually are being used to get at. So that's one thought. And then my second thought is about the way that the addition of climate to the EAW scored on the matrix. And I'm just a little concerned about that, because I think that if you look at this purpose of MEPA and environmental review, the purpose says environmental documents shall contain information that addresses the significant environmental issues of a proposed action. And so from my perspective, adding that climate information was probably the most important change that we've made to environmental review since its inception, and a change that was so extraordinary aligned with the purpose, it could not have been more appropriate and timely. And so I'm just wondering if that scoring low on the matrix is indicative that maybe there is some modification that needs to be made. I like the idea of perhaps the buckets where maybe rule changes go in their own bucket, changes that the board can implement itself would go in a different bucket, because I do think that work that the board and all of its subcommittees just completed was really in line with what the environmental quality board improvements should look like. And it was really the most appropriate and feasible when you compare it to the other options of doing a mandatory category or changing the decision criteria. Those both would require rule changes. And, as I watched the process unfold, I think the board was really trying to balance, how do we bring climate into environmental review now because it's an urgent issue and rulemaking can take years and years. And so just some fodder for thought, but I would posit that that change should have shown up as, you know, hitting it out of the park, yes, improvement for the Environmental Quality Board. And so if there's a way that the matrix could be modified that it would reflect that, that would seem to make sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Voss. Appreciate your comment. Taken under consideration. So Jesse, can you call on the next commenter?
Yeah, Chair Domberg, we have Mark. Mark, when I unmute you, if you could state your first and last name before you start speaking for the record. You are unmuted now.
My name is Mark Baker. I'm calling from Duluth, Minnesota. I'm here to comment on how an RGU's decision on a citizen's petition for environmental review here in Duluth was overturned, contrary to Chapter 116 EQB rules and local authority. In this matter, the RGU decided that an EAW was required, but the project proposal did not agree to this decision. But instead of appealing to the courts, the proposer and staff from the city approached the EQB staff and were told that an administrative appeal was appropriate. However, the EQB staff failed to explain to city staff and to the proposer and to their legal counsel that while the real rules do not prevent an administrative appeal at the local level, the regulatory framework for that appeal cannot simply be pulled out of thin air and applied to their concern. But that's exactly what happened here. An appeal of the RGU decision was allowed to be heard by an administrative body who was not the RGU. And it was allowed weeks after the statutory deadline for a decision on the EAW to be made. And it was justified by a chapter in the city code that does not control environmental review. In fact, the word environmental review is not even in the chapter that they relied on. This was explained to EQB staff on many occasions, but this fell on deaf ears. This erroneous decision by this administrative body that was not the RGU has now been published in the EQB Monitor and is apparently going to be allowed to stand. This is unfortunate. I hope the board will investigate this improper decision and take appropriate action to remedy this injustice. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Mr. Baker. And I understand Executive Director Nuschler might have some additional information she can share right now on that. I'm going to turn it to you, ED Nuschler.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I did talk about this a little bit before you were able to join us in terms of bringing folks' attention to the comments that were provided by Mr. Baker and by two other citizens of Duluth who were the petitioners for the EAW in this case. It is a tough situation, and we have spoken to the petitioners several times, and I absolutely understand their frustration. A lot of the questions that were raised to us concern the administrative processes of the city of Duluth, and we feel it would be inappropriate for the EQB to attempt to interpret or control the choices that the RGUs make about how their decisions are made. And so that would that is what we have shared with the petitioners. And I think, Madam Chair, you and I discussed potentially asking Attorney General Keeling to look into this a little bit and provide future information to the board. If that is something that the board would like. We have been consulting with her during this process.
Yes, thanks, Executive Director Neuscher. Yes, I'd appreciate that. I'd like to request some legal review on that.
I would as well. I definitely support that process. This is Joseph Bauerkemper, public member, and just want to endorse that idea to pursue further insight. It seems clear that there's not a shared understanding of who the RGU is in this case, and so I think we could benefit from some informed interpretation of all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, public member Bauerkemper. And then Jesse, are there any other commenters?
Chair Daubenberger, Mark Baker has raised his hand again. So Mark, you are unmuted.
Thank you. I will be brief. We understand the EQB's staff reluctance to weigh in on a legal issue. This is not that. The RGU is either one body or it's another. It can't be both. And the city code is what it is. This is not an interpretation of the administrative rules or processes of a city. The RGU is either one entity or it's another entity. And the city itself it's ensconced in ordinance who the RGU is. It's not difficult. It's simple. This is a travesty. And I hope that the board can move and find some way to end this miscarriage. And I appreciate your time today very much and your work.
Thank you for your second comment, Mr. Baker. And I do see another hand up. Jesse, I'm going to call on Ms. Keeling. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Daubenberger. I just wanted to get a little more clarification. Sorry, my hand keeps facing, I'm trying to lower it. Trying to get a little bit more clarification on the exact questions you're asking for me to respond to.
Thank you for that, Ms. Keeling. I think what we'll do is after this meeting, send you the additional comments that staff has gotten to questions on this, if that's okay with you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Jesse, are there any other commenters?
There are no, Chair Daubenberger, there are no other hands raised.
Thank you. All right. So I believe then that concludes the public comment period. Thank you all who commented today. And that brings us to the end of the agenda. So at this point, I would like to take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion carries and the meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so.